Young Dracula was a show on CBBC that ran from the 21st of September 2006 to the 31st of March 2014. Throughout that time it managed to air 5 series, with a total of 66 episodes. In this video I'm going to do a retrospective of all 5 series, so let's get on with it and start with Series 1. So for the start we'll go for Series 1 and 2 because Series 1 and 2, unlike the later series, is not just a comedy, drama, horror type thing. It's also a sitcom, which is an aspect of the show that they would later drop in later years. But anyway, on to the premise. Young Dracula stars Garen Howell as the titular Vladimir Dracula, who is the young Dracula in this series, but there's also another young Dracula as well called Ingrid, who is played by Claire Thomas, both of which are children to the famous Count Dracula, played by Kenneth Lee Castle. They, alongside Renfield, have to flee Transylvania because of angry peasant mobs. And out of all the places they could have fled to in the world, where do they go? Stokely. And no, not the one in England, the one in Wales. So pretty much no one's ever going to find them there. And while characters like Count Dracula himself and Renfield are from the Bram Stoker novel, their characterizations here are completely different in some cases. For example, Renfield here is actually Renfield Jr., which is something we find out in Series 2, and the reason that he's basically a butler for the Draculas is because, well, he's being promised to be turned into a vampire someday. Yes, this version of Renfield wants to become a vampire so that he can become immortal. Though it's very clear from the off that Count Dracula has no intention of ever doing that, because 1, he would lose his manservant, although really he's more of a slave throughout the series, and 2, biting Renfield's neck to him would be absolutely disgusting. Vlad also takes along his stuffed hellhound called Zoltan, voiced by Andy Bradshaw, who is basically a stuffed dog on wheels. Zoltan's role, at least in the first 2 series, is to give Vlad the voice of reason and advice, and until Vlad came to Stokely, Zoltan was basically Vlad's only actual friend. On the same day the Draculas move into the new castle in Stokely, well, new to them anyway, they are spotted by Dracula fanatic Robin Branagh, played by Craig Roberts. Him being obsessed with vampires to the point where throughout the first series he constantly wears a cape, yes, even to school, he manages to sneak into Stokely Castle, and this is where he first comes across Vlad, who reluctantly admits that he's a real vampire, but him and his older sister Ingrid are both under 16. In this universe, basically, vampire-born children don't actually get their full vampire powers until their 16th birthday. Until then, they can still go out in the sun, eat garlic bread, and basically don't have any of the invulnerabilities that regular vampires have until then. For the most part, they're just regular children up until that point. And Vlad, unlike his sister Ingrid, doesn't want to ever go through the transformation. He doesn't want to bite people, and instead he wants to just live like any other breather out there, and hates the fact that he's a vampire. Whereas his sister Ingrid absolutely relishes every moment and can't wait till her 16th birthday to become a vampire. Ingrid's goal is to become the heir to the Dracula throne, but since the Dracula and vampire heritage is based on, well, stuff from the 1800s, 1500s, all the way a time ago, unfortunately, it's the eldest son who is heir to the throne, and girls do not inherit the title. Several times throughout the series, Ingrid tries to prove herself to her father, who really most of the time couldn't give less of a shit about her and wants to just marry her off to just get rid of her, to try and prove to herself that she is more worthy to the vampire throne. Though, as I said before, this is to no avail because Count Dracula himself doesn't really care. Anyway, back to the first episode. Robin then eventually escapes, with a bit of help from Vlad, of course. Later that night, Vlad sneaks over to Robin's house, where he climbs up the window. At this point, Robin is still not 100% certain if Vlad is actually telling the truth about him becoming a vampire, until his father literally pulls him out the window and literally flies him back home. Overall, this is a pretty good pilot to the series, though it doesn't introduce everything, which in this case is actually a good thing. Too many pilots try to shove in every single character who's going to be a mainstay in the series, whereas this just focuses on the core Draculas and also Robin. The second episode is really where things start to really fall into place and set up the sort of sitcom that the first two series would ultimately be like. Again, this thing will be dropped slowly bit by bit. So, Vlad wants to go to the Breathers' school. Though his father initially bans him from going to such schools, Vlad makes his father think that if he doesn't send him to school, then a peasant mob will come and they'll have to move again. So, in which case, Dracula makes both of his kids go to school, which is thrilling for Vlad, but Ingrid is absolutely pissed off about it. This episode is also where we get introduced to the rest of Robin's family, the Branners, and most of them, to be honest, are just kind of there. For example, Ian and Paul Branner, Robin's older brothers, are basically just there to basically swan over Ingrid the whole time. This is the one thing that Ingrid actually likes about going to school, in that basically she can get pretty much any of the boys to do whatever she likes for them, in the vain promise that she will go out with them or show them any actual affection. Robin's younger sister Chloe acts as the more rational and more intelligent out of the Branners. She also very quickly finds out that Vlad is a Dracula and an actual vampire. She, throughout the series, would try and help Vlad in any way that she could to try and stop him from becoming a vampire, but also, again, like Zoltan, being the voice of reason, but from a different perspective. Also, I don't know if this was on Count Dracula's part or not, but it could be for him to remain incognito. He is generally only ever referred to as Mr. Count.
Rush, I am trying to sleep! What peasant dares knock at my palace of doom?
Hello. You must be Mr.
Count.
Mr. Count.
Yes, throughout the series, basically every breather calls him Mr. Count, with a couple of exceptions, which we'll get onto. So, at the school, we get introduced to Eric and Jonathan Van Helsing.
Know what I've got planned for this weekend?
Let me guess. We're gonna stake out the castle, as usual, look for vampires, as usual, find nothing, as usual, go home and watch your Doctor Who DVDs, as usual.
Well, that's where you're wrong.
Really?
Your DVD's broken.
Yep, these are the descendants of the Van Helsings, and Eric Van Helsing basically is a devout slayer, but he also has the problem of basically believing that anyone in a goth phase is a vampire. Whereas his son Jonathan doesn't believe in vampires and is basically trying to stop his father from being dragged off to the loony bin. This is a running joke and gag throughout the first series, where Eric Van Helsing basically constantly tries to catch out Vlad and Ingrid, and also Count Dracula, as being vampires or trying to slay them, only to be foiled at the last minute and for Jonathan to walk in and to apologise for his father's behaviour. And that, after that long-winded bit, is basically the premise for the first two series for the most part. Series 1 is basically a typical problem of the week, and this could be, Van Helsing, this could be Vlad getting into his own problems, like having to do the vampire tests that are basically equivalent to a GCSE type thing. We also get introduced in this series to a recurring character, Vlad and Ingrid's mother, Magda, who is revealed to have ran off at some point with a werewolf called Patrick. And I do love the fact that they try and make him sound as pathetic as possible by giving him the name Pat. And basically her deal is, whenever she shows up, it's basically to try and manipulate either money, power, or whatever else from her former husband. With each scenario basically going by Dracula rejects her as soon as she comes in, but then he hopelessly falls back in love with her, only to reject her again at the end of the episode, where he finds out what she was really up to. In fact, this gets to the point where in Series 2 they even make a joke about it.
Be on the menu.
Right.
Vlad, your mum and dad are fighting.
Robin, they're always fighting.
But don't take that as a bad thing, because to be honest, it's enjoyable. It is fun and enjoyable. Everyone here is giving top performances, and to be honest, any scene with Kenneth Lee as Count Dracula, he is absolutely chewing the scenery here. He can manage to be over the top sometimes, but also be intimidating as well at the exact same time. He can be cowardly, for example, if he was threatened by a breather peasant mob, but also be brave in the fact that he would absolutely sacrifice his own undead life for his children. Well, Vlad, and although we probably won't admit, probably also Ingrid. But anyway, let's get on to the first series finale, which is where things actually start to change, at least in the status quo. So yeah, it's worth mentioning for some reason Series 1 is 14 episodes, whereas every other series is 13 episodes, which, yeah, is a little bit odd. It's also worth mentioning here, because I don't know where else to put it, in that Young Dracula, at least for Series 1 and 2, was filmed on videotape, and was actually probably one of the last programs the BBC ever made that was actually made on videotape, although it was edited and made to give it a more filmic look. Anyway, Dracula decides that he's finally ready to have a new wife, and so decides to host a vampire hunting ball, where basically he invites some peasants along to Stokely Castle, along with basically all of his vampire friends, and basically there, at the stroke of midnight, him and all of his other vampire friends are basically going to hunt the local breather peasants and, well, do the vampire type thing, while also trying to find a suitable female at the Dracula ball at the same time. Ingrid, being the villain that she is, decides to invite the Branners over to be the titulary peasants that, well, the vampire stuff happens to. Though towards midnight, after Mrs. Branner gives her a gift, Ingrid actually shows that, yeah, she is capable of, sympathy and that, and actually feels bad for what she does, and basically lies to Mrs. Branner and says it's awful and that they should all go, and desperately tries to get them to leave. At the same time as this, Jonathan, who is getting really sick of his father, basically constantly saying that they're all vampires at Stokely Castle, decides that to give his father an ultimatum. Basically, if he's able to go inside and look around the castle and find no evidence of them being vampires, then he will have to basically stop the whole thing and basically forget about the whole Slayer thing. However, once Jonathan actually goes in, he actually overhears a conversation and actually learns that, oh, they are actually vampires, and this is the thing obviously that will change. He then realises that the whole time that his father was completely right. Van Helsing manages to catch Vlad at school alone in his office, or classroom / office, you know what I mean. He ties him up and heads off to the castle to basically slay all the vampires. He forces Jonathan though to stay behind, saying that this is not his time. Sometime after he's left, Vlad actually manages to convince Jonathan to release him to stop a bloodbath, because, yeah, it turns out Eric Van Helsing, despite how devoted and mad he is about being a slayer, he's never actually slain a vampire, and this will be his first time ever slaying a vampire. And yeah, basically the fact that he's gonna go in at the deep end is a bit of an understatement in a castle full of vampires. Suffice to say that basically everyone manages to escape and everyone is perfectly fine. And it's at this point as well that Count Dracula finds out about Eric Van Helsing being a slayer, something Vlad was scared about him knowing, because if he found out then that might mean that he would be forced to leave. But to his surprise, Count Dracula is actually thrilled about this, seeing that it will be so much more fun now that there's a slayer about. Thus ending Series 1.